"You're too young for an old cowboy." Caleb said it to the dark coming down over the oak woods, to the woman standing above him at the top of the porch steps, to himself most of all. The words had been waiting in his mouth for weeks. They came out flat, like a man laying a card he'd folded over 100 times. Amelia didn't move. The last yellow light slid down through the leaves and lay across her face, and she looked at him, the way she looked at everything, slow, careful, taking the full measure before she spoke. But that was the end of it, or near the end. To know how a man gets to a sentence like that, you have to go back to the start, back 8 weeks, to a hot afternoon in the summer of 1884, when a hired wagon came rattling up the lane through the Oklahoma oak woods, and Caleb Turner figured a mistake had been made. He'd been splitting stove wood in the side yard when he heard the wheels. Nobody came up that lane. The Hadley place was 4 miles east, the road to town 5 miles south, and in between there was just Caleb and the oaks and the creek that ran low this time of year. He set the axe in the block and walked around front, wiping his hands down his trousers, and there it was, a livery rig from town. The driver, already swinging Toomsare the horse around to leave. A woman stood in the dust beside it, one carpet bag at her feet. She had on a gray traveling dress, gone tan with road dust at the hem, and a bonnet she'd pushed back off her head so it hung by its ribbon, dark hair coming loose. Younger than him by 30 years, easy. She looked at the cabin, at the swept boards of the porch, at the rocking chair sitting empty in the shade, at the tin cup left to dry on the porch rail. She looked at all of it before she looked at him. "Mr. Turner?" she said. "That's me. I'm Amelia. Amelia Rose." She said it like the name ought to mean something to him. When his face didn't change, she gave a small breath and squared her shoulders, the way a person braces a little before lifting something heavy. "You wrote to Mrs. Alcott's marriage agency, the one that advertises in the Eastern papers," I answered. Caleb stood there. A jay screamed somewhere back in the oaks. The livery wagon was already 100 yards down the lane, dust hanging gold behind it, and he had the foolish urge to call it back. "There's been a mistake," he said. "There hasn't." She bent and picked up the carpet bag. Her hands were steady. "I have your letter. 2 of them. You signed both." He had, or his name was on them. Della Hadley had done most of the writing, sitting at his table with her spectacles down her nose, telling him a man his age living alone out here was a sorrow to behold, and she wouldn't watch it any longer. He'd let her. He'd signed because it was easier than arguing, because it was easier, and because he'd never once believed anything would come of it. A man of 60, gray to the roots, hands like saddle leather, a dead wife 11 years in the ground. Who answers that? This woman, apparently. "Ma'am," he said, "I don't know what Della told the agency, but you've come a long way for a poor bargain. There's a coach back to town Thursday. You're welcome to the bed till then. I'll take the barn." Amelia didn't answer that. She came up the porch steps, set her bag down by the door, and instead of going inside, she crossed to the rocking chair in the shade. Ruth's chair, the one nobody had sat in since. And she lowered herself into it like she'd been walking toward it her whole life. The chair gave its old familiar creak. Caleb opened his mouth to tell her that chair wasn't for sitting in. He stood there with the words ready, and he could not make himself say a single one of them. He didn't sleep much in the barn. The mare shifted in her stall, and the crickets sawed away in the grass outside, and Caleb lay on the old straw tick he kept for shearing season and stared at the dark underside of the loft. A woman was in his house. In Ruth's bed, he'd told her, though he doubted she'd taken it. He was up before the sun, the way he always was, and he had the coffee going on the stove when she came out of the back room. She'd slept in her clothes, he could tell, the gray dress more creased than before. Her hair was pinned up neat. She stood in the doorway and watched him at the stove a moment. "You can sit," he said. "Coffee's near ready." She sat at the table. He reached up into the cupboard for cups, and his hand came down with 2 of them, the way it always did, the way it had for 11 years, one for him and one for nobody. And he set them both on the table before his mind caught up to his hand. He stood there looking at the second cup. Amelia reached over and slid it toward herself. "I take mine black," she said. and lifted the pot and poured for them both. Caleb sat down across from her. The pocket watch on its nail by the door had stopped sometime in the night. He'd forgotten to wind it again. The light through the window was the gray going to gold. That meant the day would be hot. "You wrote 2 letters," she said. "I'll be honest with you, Mr. Turner. The second one didn't sound like the first." Della Hadley wrote the first. "I thought as much." A small thing moved at the corner of her mouth, almost a smile, gone before it landed. The first one used the word helpmeet 3 times and said you had a tender and generous spirit. The second one was 4 lines. It said you had a roof that didn't leak, a milk cow, and no debts, and that you were 60 years old and a poor bargain, and I should know it before I spent the fare. That one was mine. "I know," she said. "That's the one I answered." He didn't know what to do with that, so he drank his coffee. It was bitter and too strong. He'd never learned to make it any other way. "I'll tell you my piece, since you told me yours," she said. She turned her cup a half turn on the table, watching it instead of him. "I'm 30 years old. Back in Missouri, I was living in my brother's house, minding his children and his wife. Counted every biscuit I ate. They had a man picked out for me. A widower in town, 50-odd, owned the feed store. He had 4 children and a temper, and the way my brother put it, beggars don't get to be choosers, and I'd best be grateful." She turned the cup again. "I'd rather come west to a stranger I chose than stay east for a stranger they chose for me. That's the whole truth of it. I'm not running from the law, and I'm not running from a man. I just wanted the choosing to be mine." Caleb looked at her across the table. The morning light had reached her hands where they sat around the cup. "Working hands, not soft. That's a sensible reason," he said. "Doesn't change the arithmetic. You're young, I'm not. In 10 years you'll be nursing an old man. And that's the best case. There's better bargains in town than me." "You keep saying bargain," she said, "like I came to buy a horse. You know what I mean." "I do." She set the cup down. "Here's what I'll offer you, Mr. Turner. I'll stay through harvest. I'll earn my keep. I can cook. I can put up preserves. I can mend. I can keep a garden better than most. You'll have no cause to call me a burden. And come the end of harvest, if you still want to put me on a coach, you can. No promises asked, none given." That seemed fair. It seemed more than fair. It seemed like a way to be kind to a man and let him keep his pride at the same time, and he wasn't used to either one. "Through harvest," he said. "Through harvest." He showed her the place after breakfast because she asked. The cabin was 2 rooms and a loft, the back room hers now, the front room the kitchen and his. There was the barn, the smokehouse, the well, the garden gone to weeds since June because he'd let it. He showed her the milk cow, Bess, and the chickens, and the sorrel mare named Pet that Ruth had named. And when Amelia asked the cow's name and he told her, she said it the cow's way, soft, and the cow came to the rail. It was in the front room, on the shelf by the window, that she found Ruth. Not a likeness. There were no photographs, just the things. A hairbrush with a silver back gone dull, a thimble, and folded in the cedar chest at the foot of the bed when Amelia opened it looking for extra blankets. A quilt only 2/3 pieced, the needle still threaded through the last block. The way a woman leaves a thing she means to come back to. The needle had waited 11 years. Amelia knelt by the chest. She didn't touch the needle. "This was your wife's." "Ruth," he said. The name came out rough. He hadn't said it aloud in a long time. "It's beautiful work." Amelia smoothed her palm an inch above the cloth, not touching. "May I finish it for you?" "I'd be careful." I'd match her stitch. Caleb stood in the doorway with his hat in his hand. He looked at the needle waiting in the cloth, where Ruth had left it the autumn the fever took her, and he found he could not give an answer either way. He set his hat on the peg and went out to the woodpile, and he didn't come back in until noon. She'd been there a week when she figured out he had somewhere he went. Twice now he'd saddled Pet before light and ridden off without a word, gone the whole morning, come back at noon, with sawdust on his sleeves or his knuckles barked. He never said where. She didn't ask. But the third time, she watched which way he took the lane, and the next morning she got up in the dark, packed bread and a jar of buttermilk in a pail, and walked. The road east ran 4 miles to the Hadley place, then bent past a smaller farm she didn't know. She found him at the smaller farm. He was up on the roof of a gray little house, stripped to his shirt in the climbing heat, pulling rotten shingles and laying new cedar ones, and the steady knock of his hammer carried clear across the field. An old woman stood at the bottom of the ladder, with her hand shading her eyes. Amelia stopped at the fence line where the oaks gave shade, and she watched Oaked. She watched a long time. He worked the way some men pray, like there was no one teen to see and it wouldn't have mattered if there were. When he came down for water, the old woman tried to press coins into his hand, folding his fingers over them, and Caleb folded them right back open and set the coins on the rail and shook his head and said something that made the old woman laugh and swat at him. He never saw Amelia. She left the bread and buttermilk on the Hadley's porch on her way back and didn't tell him she'd come. That evening she set his supper down and said, "Whose roof?" He went still over his plate. "Mrs. Ames' widow. Her husband passed in the spring, and that roof's been letting rain in on her since. She pay you?" "No." He said it like it was a strange question. "She hasn't got it. And if she had it, she'd need it worse than me." "How many roofs have you mended that don't pay?" Caleb picked up his fork. "A roof's not much to a man with 2 good arms and nowhere to be." That was all he'd say. But Amelia had begun to keep a kind of ledger in her head, and that went into it. There was the chair, too. The second one at the table she understood now. She filled it. But there was a third thing she'd taken weeks to notice. A place that stayed empty and ready. Every Sunday Caleb cleaned a plate and set it at the end of the table with a cup beside it, and nobody came. And after supper, he put them away again, unused. "Who's the plate for?" she asked the second Sunday. "Anybody," he said. Drover passing through. Tramp off the rails. A man on the road can see from the lane there's a place set. He knows he can knock, and there's no shame in it. He shrugged, gathering the clean fork. Ruth started it. Seemed wrong to quit. "Does anyone come?" "Sometimes." Less now. The spur line moved. He set the plate back in the cupboard. "Don't cost anything to leave a place ready." Amelia thought a man could spend his whole life keeping a chair ready for strangers, and never once let himself believe one was being kept for him. She didn't say it. She washed the unused cup and put it away. It wasn't a week later that one of those passing men did come. A drifter, gaunt and trail-worn, a bedroll over one shoulder, knocked at the door at dusk, having seen the lamp from the lane. Caleb sat him down at the ready plate and filled it without a word about pay. And then he did the thing Amelia would remember longest. He listened. The man talked about a wife buried down in Texas, a homestead lost to the drought, a boy he hadn't had word from in 2 years. And Caleb didn't fill the silences, or fix anything, or turn it back to his own troubles. He leaned in with his elbow and his eyes on the man's table and his eyes on the man's face, like what a broke stranger had to say was worth every minute of the evening. He asked one quiet question and then let the man take all the time he needed answering it. The drifter slept in the barn and went on at first light, standing a little straighter than he'd come. Amelia put that in the ledger too, and she underlined it. On the Saturday, they drove to town for flour and coffee and nails. It was the first time she'd been to Ashford Springs, and it was smaller than the town she'd left. One street of false front buildings, a church at the end of it, white in the sun, a livery, a bank no bigger than a parlor. Caleb pulled the buckboard up in front of Pell's general store and helped her down with a hand that let go the second her feet found the boards. Inside it was cool and dim, and smelled of coffee beans and leather, and the sharp green of pickle brine. A Cracker Barrel by the counter. Bolts of calico stacked on the shelf. A glass jar of penny candy that a boy stood worshipping. Behind the counter, a heavy woman in a starched apron looked up, and her face did something quick and bright when she saw who'd come in with Caleb Turner. "Why, Caleb?" She came around the counter. "And you've brought a guest. Mrs. Pell. This is Amelia Rose. She's keeping house out at my place." Keeping house. Mrs. Pell smiled at Amelia with all her teeth. "Isn't that nice? All the way from?" "Missouri," Amelia said. "Missouri, my, and no people out here at all? Just you and Caleb?" "Way out there?" The questions came smooth and friendly. The way a hand pats a horse, it means to bridle. "However, did the two of you come to an arrangement like that?" Through correspondence, Amelia said. Correspondence. Mrs. Pell's eyes went from Amelia to Caleb and back, and the math she did was plain on her face. Well, isn't that modern? Caleb laid his list on the counter. 40-pound flour, 10 of coffee, a keg of cut nails, and whatever she needs for putting up the garden. They got their goods. Amelia chose her preserving jars and her paraffin and a card of buttons and a yellow hair ribbon for a girl child she didn't have, then put the ribbon back. While Caleb loaded the buckboard, a young man came across from the livery, tall, clean-shaven, good boots, a hat he took off the moment he saw Amelia. He had an open, easy face, the kind that had never had a door shut on it. "Tom Avery," he said, and put out his hand to Caleb first, the way a well-raised man does. "Mr. Turner, good to see you in town." Then to Amelia, with a small bow that wasn't put on. "Ma'am, welcome to Ashford Springs. I run the Avery place north of the river. If you ever need anything, you've only to send word." He smiled, set his hat back on, and went, and the whole of it was as decent as anything could be. Caleb watched him cross to the livery, easy and unhurried, a young man with good boots, and no door ever shut in his face. Then Caleb turned and finished loading the buckboard, and did not say one word. They drove out of town with the goods. Amelia rode beside him and said nothing for a mile. It was as they'd been leaving the store that she'd heard it. She'd gone back in for the thread she'd forgotten, and the door hadn't quite shut behind her, and Mrs. Pell's voice carried from the back, where she stood with another woman, dropped low but not low enough. "Poor thing," Mrs. Pell had said, "came all this way, and him old enough to be her father, older. It's not Christian, a man taking advantage of a girl's situation like that. Somebody ought to say something to her, for her own good." Amelia had picked up her thread and laid her coin on the counter and walked out with her chin level. She didn't have to. As they passed the church at the edge of town, he kept his eyes on the road, and his jaw was set hard, and she knew then that the door had been open on his side too. He had heard every word. Harvest came on the way it always did, all at once, after weeks of waiting. The corn went hard in the ear, and the field had to be brought in before. The crows and the weather took their share, and for that there was no such thing as one person's work or another's. There was only the work. Amelia surprised him. He'd thought he'd be carrying her, that he'd have to find soft jobs to keep her out of the heat. Instead, she tied her skirts up out of the dirt and worked the rows beside him, snapping ears and dropping them in the sack across her shoulder, and she kept his pace, and then she kept ahead of it. Her hands blistered the first day, and she wrapped them in rags, and she wrapped them in rags and went back at it the second day without a word about it. By the third day, the blisters had gone to calluses, and she'd stopped wrapping them. "You've done field work," he said. They were at the wagon, drinking from the same dipper because there was one dipper. Brothers' farm. She wiped her mouth with the back of her wrist. "I told you I earned my keep there." He just never called it earning. They worked the cool of the mornings and the long gold of the evenings and laid up through the worst of the midday heat under the barn's shadow. The cicadas droned in the oaks, loud enough some afternoons to feel like a pressure behind the eyes. The creek had gone to a trickle. Everything wanted rain. It came on the fifth afternoon, fast, the way summer storms came up over the plain, a wall of green-black cloud climbing the western sky, while they were still in the field, and the light going strange and copper, and the wind turning cool all at once and laying the corn over flat. Caleb felt the first fat drops while they were still 100 yards from the barn. "Run," he said, and they ran. They didn't make it dry. The sky opened halfway across the yard and came down in sheets. Warm rain, summer rain, soaking them to the skin in the time it took to reach the barn's eave, and they fetched up under it, laughing. Both of them, he realized later, he'd actually laughed, pressed back against the gray boards with the water roaring off the roof a hand's breadth in front of their faces. The rain came down like the bottom had dropped out of something. It hammered the tin and ran in a silver curtain off the eave and turned the yard to a sheet of brown water in under a minute. Amelia's hair had come all the way down and lay dark and flat against her neck. She was breathing hard from the run, and she pushed the wet hair off her face and looked up at the reins, and then over at him, still laughing, and the laugh went quiet, and they looked at each other. He didn't look away. That was the thing he'd remember. For one long moment, under the roar of the rain, he looked at her, and she looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them looked away, and the 11 years he'd spent being careful went thin as paper. Then a sheet of lightning lit the yard white, and the thunder came right on top of it and broke the moment, and she startled and laughed again, and he said something about the corn being laid flat, and they stood and watched the rain instead of each other. But it had happened. He couldn't make it unhappen. The evenings after that were different, though nothing was said. The rain a card he'd folded over 100 times. The rain had freshened everything and broken the worst of the heat, and they took to sitting out on the porch after supper while the light went down through the oaks. He'd brought the second rocking chair up from the barn loft, without quite deciding to. His own chair, an old one, set beside Ruth's, so there were two on the porch again. He whittled. He'd always whittled. Little things. A comb, a clothespin, a spoon, his hands kneading something while the rest of him sat still, and Amelia had taken Ruth's quilt out of the cedar chest. She'd asked him a second time plainer. "I'll put it away and never mention it again if you tell me to," she'd said. "But it wants finishing. A thing like that, half done, it's a sorrow sitting in a box. Let me finish it." And this time he'd been able to say yes, one word, and walk out before he had to say more. And that night she'd brought it to the porch and started in, matching Ruth's stitch the way she'd promised, small and even, picking up where the needle had waited 11 years. He couldn't watch it at first. Then he found he could. She was a fine hand with a needle, he said one evening. The fireflies were coming up out of the long grass, blinking low across the yard. Better than the cooking, truth be told. Her biscuits could stop a clock. Amelia's hands kept moving. What was she like? He turned the comb he was carving, took a long curl of wood off it. He hadn't talked about Ruth to anyone in years. There hadn't been anyone to talk to. There hadn't been anyone to talk to, and talking to yourself about the dead was a road that didn't end anywhere good. But the dark was kind, and the needle kept moving, and Amelia didn't look up at him, which somehow made it possible. She laughed easy, he said. Loud, for a small woman. Embarrassed herself in church with it once or twice. He smiled at the comb. She wasn't soft. Folks think a kind woman's a soft woman. She'd give the shirt off her back to a stranger, and then tell him exactly what she thought of his foolishness while she did it. We had no children. That was a grief to her, more than to me, though I never minded the way she thought I minded. He worked the knife. She got the fever in the fall. 11 years back. It went quick. Some mercies are the kind you don't want. Amelia let that sit. She put 3 more stitches in before she spoke. "Thank you for telling me. Your turn," he said. And it surprised him, the asking. "You told me the why of coming. You didn't tell me the why under the why." The needle paused. Out in the grass, the fireflies went on with their slow signaling. When she spoke, her voice had dropped lower. "My mother died when I was 19, she said. I kept her house for my father after, and then he passed. And then it was my brother's house. And there was always somebody's house to keep, and never one that was mine. I wasn't unhappy." Exactly. I just looked up one day, and I was 30, and I'd spent my whole life being useful in other people's lives, and I'd never once been chosen for anything. Just handed around to where I was needed. She tied off a thread, bit it clean. When your letter came, the short one, the honest one, I thought, here's a man who told me the worst of it up front, and let me decide. That was the first time anybody'd let me decide. I'd have come for that alone. Caleb sat with that, while the knife had gone still in his hands. He wanted, right then, to reach across the little space between the 2 chairs and take her hand. The want came up so strong and sudden it scared him. His hand actually moved, lifted an inch off the arm of the chair, and then he thought of Tom Avery taking off his hat, young and clean, and with 40 good years in front of him. And he thought of a church full of faces doing arithmetic, and he set his hand back down. He took up the knife again. "Getting on to dark," he said. "I'll see to the stock." He went, and the porch boards creaked behind him, and Amelia sat alone with the quilt and the fireflies, and let out a breath she'd been holding. She finished the row before she went in, Then she folded the quilt over the back of Ruth's chair instead of putting it away in the chest, and she sat a minute, looking at the dark, where he'd gone. "I'm not counting the days till harvest anymore," she said, when he came back up onto the porch. She said it plain to the yard, not to him. Caleb stood with his hand on the door latch. The crickets had taken over from the cicadas the way they did once the dark came full. He stood there a long moment, his thumb working the worn latch, and he did not trust his own voice, so he did not use it. He set the knife down on the rail. He did not answer her. He went inside, and he heard, through the wall, the small sounds of her folding herself into sleep. And he lay awake in the front room, a long time listening to a house that, for the first time in 11 years, had two people breathing in it. She wanted to go to church. He'd known she would. Caleb hadn't sat in a pew since the second year after Ruth. It wasn't that he'd quit believing. He'd just stopped being able to bear the kindness of people, the hands on his shoulder, the casseroles, the way grief turned a man into a thing that happened to other people, easier to be alone with it. But Amelia laid out her good dress on the Saturday night and pressed it with the flat iron heated on the stove, and Sunday morning she came out in it, the gray gone, a blue calico he hadn't seen, her hair done careful, and she said, "Will you drive me, or do I walk?" He drove her. Ashford Springs Methodist sat white at the end of the street with its one bell, going as they came up, and the yard was full of buggies and saddle horses and families in their Sunday best. And Caleb felt every eye find the buckboard before he'd even find the buckboard before he'd even set the brake. He helped her down. He walked her up the steps with his hat in his hand. And the church, which had been full of the ordinary Sunday murmur, went quiet in pieces as they came down the aisle, a hush spreading row by row, heads turning and turning back, until by the time they took a pew near the rear, the loudest thing in the building was the creak of the boards under Caleb's boots. He stared at the hymnal rack in front of him. Beside him, Amelia sat straight and faced front like she'd noticed nothing, though her gloved hands were folded a little too still in her lap. Reverend Cobb did them the mercy of not looking at them any longer than at anyone else. He preached on the widow's mite, on the gifts that don't look like gifts, and if he meant anything by it, Caleb couldn't tell. The man's voice was level and kind, and gave nothing away. The pump organ wheezed through the hymns. Mrs. Pell, 2 rows up, turned around once during the doxology and beamed at them both with a warmth that had teeth in it. It was after, in the churchyard, that it got hard. There was to be a dinner on the grounds, tables set up under the oaks, the women laying out fried chicken and pie and bowls of beans, and there was no leaving without giving offense, so they stayed. Amelia was swept up at once by the women, claimed, surrounded, asked her sweet poison questions, and she answered them all with a level chin while they smiled and smiled. Caleb stood off at the edge of it with the men who talked cattle prices and the dry creek and said nothing at all about the woman he'd brought, which was its own kind of saying something. And then Tom Avery came across the grass. He came to Amelia. He did it openly, in front of God and the whole congregation, which Caleb understood was the honorable way to do a thing like this. No sneaking, no corners. He brought her a plate he'd fixed himself and a cup of lemonade, and he stood with her under the oaks and made her laugh, once, a real laugh. And Caleb watched from 40 feet off and felt the ground shift under everything. The boy was good. That was the worst of it. Tom Avery wasn't a fool, or a brute, or a fortune hunter. He was a decent young man, with good land and good manners and a kind face. And he was looking at Amelia the way a man looks at a future he means to build. And he was the right age to build it. Caleb watched the two of them standing in the dappled light, both of them young, both of them upright and easy in their bodies the way only the young are. And he saw it the way the whole town saw it. He saw the rightness of it. He saw exactly what Amelia could have, and exactly what she'd settled for instead, out of nobody's choosing but a stubborn pride in having chosen. Mrs. Pell appeared at his elbow, with a plate she pressed on him, whether he wanted it or not. "Don't they make a handsome pair?" she said, watching Tom and Amelia. She said it gently. That was the cruelty of it. she said it gently. Like a friend, like a Christian woman doing a hard duty. Caleb, I've known you 20 years, and I'll say to you what I'd say to my own brother. That girl came out here in a hard spot, and she's making the best of it. And you've been good to her, I don't doubt it. But she's 30, and you're 60. In 10 years, she'll be a widow nursing a grave. And a young woman like that, she could have a whole life. Children, even. You ever think on that? What you're keeping her from, by keeping her. She patted his arm. For her own good, that's all. I say it for her own good. She moved off. Caleb stood with the plate going cold in his hand, main cold in a vein, and could not have named one thing on it. Across the yard, Amelia had seen him standing alone. She left the women and the lemonade and Tom Avery's good company and came across the grass to him, the way she'd come across his yard a dozen times now. And a few heads turned to watch her do it. You've been hiding back here the whole time, she said. Men's talk, cattle, and weather. You don't keep cattle. Then I've been listening. He set the plate down on the table behind him. He couldn't look straight at her, not with the whole churchyard's arithmetic going on around them, not with Tom Avery 40 feet off, being everything Caleb wasn't. You ought to get back. Folks'll wonder why you're standing out here with me when there's better company under the trees. She went still. Is that what you want? For me to go stand under the trees? I want you to have what's good for you. You keep saying that. She studied him a moment the way she studied everything. And whatever she saw made her go quiet. You've decided something. I can see it on you. You've gone and decided something all by yourself again. When he didn't answer, she nodded once, slow, and turned, and walked back toward the oaks with her chin level. And he watched her go and hated himself, and did not call her back. He drove her home in the dark, the lantern swinging on its hook off the wagon bow, throwing its little circle of light onto the road. For a long while neither spoke, the horse's hooves and the creak of the axle, and the crickets in the ditches. You're quiet, Amelia said. Always am. Quieter. He didn't answer. The thing Mrs. Pell had said about children sat in his chest like a swallowed stone. He hadn't let himself think it. 11 years he and Ruth had wanted them and not had them, and he'd come to believe the lack was in him. And here was a woman who could still have a houseful, and he was the wall between her and that whole bright life. He'd known he was robbing her of years. He hadn't let himself count what else. Whatever Hattie Pell said to you, Amelia said, you can leave it on the road. She didn't say anything that isn't true. She says a great many things. Amelia turned on the seat to face him. Look at me. What did she say? But he kept his eyes on the lantern light on the road, and he wouldn't look. And after a while she turned back to face front, and that was worse than any argument. He let her off at the porch and put up the horse in the wagon, and by the time he came in she'd gone to her room. He stood in the front room a while. The quilt lay folded over the back of Ruth's chair, where she'd taken to keeping it now, near done, just the binding left. The 2 cups sat on the rail, outside the window, where they'd both come to leave them. He took his blanket off the front room bed and carried it out to the barn, and slept on the straw tick, the way he had the first night, and he told himself it was the proper thing. A man and a woman not wed under one roof with the town already talking, and he almost believed it. The truth underneath was simpler, and he knew it lying there in the dark. He knew it lying there. He was beginning the leaving. A man doesn't pull a tooth all at once if he can help it. He works it loose first. Amelia woke the next morning to a cold stove and an empty front room and the blanket gone off the bed. She made the coffee herself. She reached up into the cupboard for the cups, out of habit now, the way he did, and her hand came down with 2, and she stood there holding them both in the gray morning light. One for her and one for a man who'd slept in the barn. She looked at the second cup a long moment. Then she put it back on the shut cupboard. Then she put it back on the shelf and shut the cupboard, and she carried her own single cup out to the porch and stood drinking it alone, watching the barn door, where no smoke rose and no man came out, and on the rail beside her there was now only 1 cup, where for weeks there had been 2. He gave it 3 days. He told himself he was being sure. The truth was, he was working up the nerve, and the longer he waited the more the want fought him. So on the 3rd evening, he made himself do it before supper, while there was still light, because he didn't trust himself to do it in the dark. He'd written the letter that afternoon out in the barn where she wouldn't see, to Mrs. Alcott's marriage agency. He'd told them the arrangement had not suited and asked what was owed to release it, and he'd sealed it with the stub of wax he kept for the rare letter, and the sealed thing sat now in his shirt pocket like a stone over his heart. She was on the porch when he came up from the barn, the quilt in her lap, putting the last of the binding on by the failing light. The sun was down behind the oaks, and the whole yard had gone to that deep gold that comes just before the gray. He stopped at the foot of the steps. She was up on the porch, and he was down on the ground, one step below her, and he kept it that way on purpose, because he could not say what he had to say standing close. "I've written the agency," he said. Her hands stopped on the quilt. "Told them it didn't suit. They'll refund part of the fare, I expect, and if they don't, I'll cover the difference, so you're not out anything. There's the Thursday coach." He made himself keep going. "Tom Avery's a good man. Good land, north of the river. River bottom never goes dry. He's taken with you. Anybody can see it. You'd want for nothing, and you'd have." His voice caught, and he pushed through it. "You'd have a whole life. The kind you ought to have." Amelia set the quilt aside very slowly and stood up. She came to the top of the steps and looked down at him, and the last gold light slid down through the leaves and lay across her face, and she looked at him the way she looked at everything, slow and careful, taking the full measure before she spoke. "You're sending me to Tom Avery," she said. "I'm not sending you anywhere. I'm letting you go. There's a difference." "Is there?" It wasn't a question. "And did you think to ask me what I want, anywhere in all this deciding? You don't know what you want yet. You're 30. You think you do. Don't." Her voice came out low, and even and harder than he'd ever heard it. "Don't you tell me I don't know my own mind. Every soul I've ever lived with told me that. My father, my brother, his wife, they all knew better than me what was good for me, and I crossed 2 states to get away from people who knew better than me. And now I find I've come all this way just to live with one more." She came down 1 step toward him. "Say the true thing, Caleb. Don't dress it up in Tom Avery and my whole bright life. Say the true thing." And he said it, the words he'd been carrying in his mouth for weeks. He said them flat, like a man laying a card he'd folded over 100 times. "You're too young for an old cowboy." The yard went still. A jay called once back in the oaks and was quiet. "There," she said. "Now you've said it." Her eyes were bright, but she didn't let them spill. "That's not about me at all. That's about you. You decided a long time before I ever stepped off that wagon that you didn't get to have anything good again, and now you've found a reason to make it true. And you're calling it kindness." She smoothed the quilt once and laid it over the back of Ruth's chair. "Careful, the binding done now, and even all the way around. I'll be on the Thursday coach. You won't have to drive me. I'll walk to the Hadleys and ride in with Della." She went to the door. "I finished your wife's quilt. It's yours. It always was." She went inside. The door didn't slam. That was the thing that stayed with him. It shut soft, the latch catching with a small click, and somehow that was worse than any slam could have been. Burl Tate rode in the next afternoon. He came up the lane on his old gray, the tin star dull on his vest, and he climbed down stiff and slow the way they both did now. And he stood looking at the cabin with his thumbs in his belt. Before he said anything. Burl had been Caleb's friend 40 years. He'd stood up at Caleb's wedding to Ruth. He dug with his own hands, part of Ruth's grave, because that was the kind of thing you did for a friend in a small place. "Coffee on?" Burl said. "Always." They sat at the table. Burl looked at the cupboard, at the single cup Caleb set out, at the place where a second one should have been, and he didn't miss it. Burl never missed anything. It was what made him good at the job, and hard to drink with. "Hattie Pell's been busy," Burl said. "Whole town knows you sent the Missouri woman packing. Hattie's telling it like you did the Christian thing. Noble old Caleb, giving up the girl so she can have a proper life." He blew across his coffee. "That the story? It's the truth. It's a story." Burl set the cup down. "I've known you since we were both too young to grow a whiskers. I knew you when Ruth was alive, and I've watched you these 11 years since. And I'll tell you what I see. and then I'll get off your land and let you hate me in peace." He leaned forward. "You're not protecting that girl, Caleb. You're protecting yourself. You buried Ruth and it near killed you, and you decided that was the last grave you'd ever stand over. And you've spent 11 years making real sure you never loved anything you might have to lose again. Then she walks up your lane and you go and love her anyway. You can't help it, and it scares you worse than dying. So you're throwing her out before the dying can come for you. That's not noble. That's just a frightened man calling his fear a virtue." Caleb stared at his hands on the table. "She's 30. She's a grown woman who knows her own road. You're the one acting like a child." Burl stood, settled his hat. "You always did think too much of grief and not enough of the time you've got left. You've got good years in you yet, more than you let on. Question is whether you'll spend them in this empty house, keeping a chair ready for strangers, or whether you'll set one out for somebody and let her sit in it." He went to the door. "Thursday coach leaves at 10, just so you know." He rode off. Caleb sat at the table until the coffee went cold and the light went out of the windows. 2 untouched cups in front of him now, because somewhere in the talking Burl had taken down the second one himself, and Caleb hadn't even seen him do it. The wagon came at dawn. He heard it from the barn, where he'd gone again to not be in the house. Della Hadley's wagon, come up the lane in the first gray light. He stood in the dark of the barn doorway and watched Amelia carry the carpet bag out onto the porch, the same one she'd carried up 8 weeks before. The quilt she left behind, folded over Ruth's chair where she'd laid it. She stopped at the top of the steps and looked toward the barn. He was sure she couldn't see him in the dark of it, but she looked anyway. A long look. And then she went down the steps and climbed up beside Della, and the wagon turned in the yard and went back down the lane. Caleb stood in the barn doorway and watched it go and did not come out. The cabin was too quiet. He hadn't known a house could get quieter than empty, but it had. For 11 years he'd lived alone in it and called that quiet, and now he knew that had only been waiting. This was the real thing. The rocking chair sat still on the porch. The quilt lay folded over the back of it, finished, the binding even all the way around. Ruth's work and Amelia's work joined so close. He couldn't tell at the seam where the one hand stopped and the other took up. He left it where it was. He couldn't bring himself to move it, and he couldn't bring himself to use it. He set 1 cup out in the morning and washed 1 plate at night. He'd done it for 11 years. It had never once felt like this. He'd folded 100 times. On the second evening he caught himself reaching up for the second cup, the way his hand had always known to, and this time he let it come down with 2, and he set them both on the rail. And he looked at them a long while in the dusk, then he left them there, both of them. He couldn't have said why. In town, Amelia kept her room at Mrs. Pell's and waited on a coach she'd half decided not to take. Tom Avery came on the Tuesday. He came to the front parlor of the boarding house, with his hat in his hands, scrubbed and earnest. And Mrs. Pell showed him in with a look that said he'd arranged the whole of heaven to bring it about. He sat across from Amelia on the horsehair sofa, and he was honest and plain and kind, and he asked her, in so many words, to think of staying in Ashford Springs. To think of him. "You'd have a good life," he said. "I won't pretend I've got it all worked out pretty, but I've got land that holds water and a sound house, and I'm not a hard man, and I'd be good to you. Folks would be glad of it. It'd be," he turned his hat, "it'd be the easy thing, the right-looking thing." "It would," Amelia said. "And you're a fine man, Tom Avery. I mean that. Any woman would be lucky. But I'd be marrying you because it looked right, and I spent 30 years doing the thing that looked right to everybody but me." She folded her hands. "I won't do it again. Not even for a good man. Especially not for a good man. It wouldn't be fair to you. You ought to have a wife who's there because she chose you, not because the town fixed it up." Tom looked at her a long moment, and then, to his credit, he smiled, a little rueful. "It's the old man, isn't it? It's the old man. He know that? He's the only one who doesn't," Amelia said. Tom stood and put his hat back on, and at the door he stopped. "He's a better man than he thinks he is," he said. "Most folks round here owe him something they don't talk about. My own barn. He was 3 days helping raise it the year I came, and he'd not take a dollar, nor a mention. He nodded. If you can get it through his thick skull, you tell him, Tom Avery said, he's a fool. And he went. And that was the end of the easy, right-looking thing. Mrs. Pell had been listening from the hall, the way she listened to everything. She came in to clear the coffee, and she didn't quite meet Amelia's eye. You turned down the Avery boy, she said. I did. For Caleb Turner. Amelia set down her cup. She'd held her tongue with this woman for 8 weeks, and she found she was done holding it. Mrs. Pell, spent a deal of breath on what I ought to want. Let me tell you what I do want, and then you can talk all you like, but you'll be talking with the truth in front of you. She stood. You see an old man and a young woman, and you do your sums. I'll tell you what I see. I see a man who keeps a place set at his table every Sunday for any stranger on the road, so a hungry man can knock without shame. I see a man who climbs Mrs. Ames's roof in the heat and won't take her coins because she needs them worse. I see a man who's mended half the fences in this county, in the dark before dawn, so no one would have to thank him. I've watched him sit a broke stranger down at his own table and listen to the man's whole sorrow like it mattered more than his supper, never once turning it back to himself. My whole life I've been around men who wanted to be seen being good. I finally found one who'd rather die than be caught at it. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't have to. You look at Caleb Turner and count his years. I look at him and count what he's done with them. So you tell me, Mrs. Pell, which of us is doing the foolish sum? Mrs. Pell stood holding the coffee tray. For once in her life, she didn't have anything ready to say. Something moved across her face that might, in a smaller woman, have been shame, and might, in a better one, have been the start of a change. It was the next night. The Hadley boy took sick. Della Hadley came pounding into town past dark. Her wagon team lathered, calling for Dr. Mercer, and Dr. Mercer was 3 days gone, off 2 counties over setting a man's leg, and not expected back. Her youngest, the boy Samuel, 8 years old, had taken a fever that climbed and climbed, and now he was talking to people who weren't in the room. There was nobody. The doctor gone, the nearest other one a day's ride. Amelia was down the boarding house stairs and into her shawl before Della finished. I've nursed fever, she said. Both my parents and half my brother's children. Get me out there. They rode out into the dark. And somewhere he'd folded over 100 neighbored, because the Hadleys were his nearest neighbors, and Della's husband had sent a hand galloping the 4 miles to fetch him. The moment the boy worsened, Caleb was already saddling Pet by lantern light, and he came down the Hadley lane, not 10 minutes behind the wagon. He came through the door, and there she was, kneeling by the boy's bed with her sleeves pushed up, wringing a cloth into a basin, and she looked up and saw him, and neither of them said one word about anything but the child. Fever's bad, she said. We have to bring it down. Cool cloths and the willow bark tea if Della's got the bark, and we keep him from thrashing so he doesn't hurt himself. Della's got bark. I'll get the water cold from the spring house. That was the whole of what passed between them, and it was enough to work by. They worked the night. Caleb hauled the cold spring house water, and Amelia laid the cloths, forehead, and wrists, and the backs of the knees, changing them the moment they went warm. And Della brewed the bitter bark tea, and they spooned it past the boy's lips between his ramblings. The lamp burned low on the dresser. The boy talked to his dead grandfather and to a dog he'd had as a baby, and once, terribly, to nobody at all, his eyes wide open and seeing none of them. Amelia talked back to him low and steady, the way you gentled a spooked horse, telling him he was all right, he was home, his mother was right here, and slow, somewhere in the deepest part of the night, the fever began to turn. There was a moment near the end of it. The boy had quieted into a real sleep at last, his breathing gone long and even, and Amelia reached for the cloth in the basin at the same instant. Caleb reached to wring it out for her, and their hands met in the cool water and stayed there. Neither pulled back. The lamp guttered. Della had fallen asleep in the chair in the corner. In the dim and the quiet, in the basin of water gone tepid, Caleb's hand closed over Amelia's, and hers turned in his and held on. And they knelt there by the sleeping child and didn't speak, and didn't let go, and didn't let go. That had worked all night to pull a boy back from the dark, finding each other in the still water. The window over the bed had gone from black to gray. A rooster started up somewhere out by the Hadley barn. The boy slept on, cool now, his hair damp against the pillow, mended. They came out onto the Hadley porch in the first light to let Della sit with her son. The morning was coming up soft over the fields, the oaks black against a sky, going pink and gold, the dew heavy on everything. Caleb stood at the top of the steps and Amelia behind him, and he had his hat in his hands. And he could not look at her, because if he looked at her, he was going to lose the whole careful argument he'd built. And he turned to go down the steps and ride home to his quiet house and his 2 cups on the rail. Caleb, Amelia's voice stopped him on the first step. He turned. She stood above him in the doorway with the morning behind her, tired to the bone, her hair come loose, and she looked at him steady and level and unafraid. "I'm not done talking to you, Caleb Turner. Not by a long way. You hear me?" He should have kept walking. He'd meant to. But her voice held him there on the step with one boot lower than the other, and she came down out of the doorway after him. Down into the wet grass of the 100 Times, down into the wet grass of the Hadley yard, where the dawn was turning everything to gold, and she stood in front of him so he couldn't go around her without meaning it. "You're going to listen now," she said. "You've had your say. You said it from a stare so you wouldn't have to say it close. Now I'll have mine. And I'll say it, close enough you can't pretend you didn't hear. Amelia, you're too old, you said." She kept on like he hadn't spoken. "You'll leave me a widow. I'll waste my young years nursing a grave. I might have had children with a younger man." She nodded. "All true, maybe. Every word. And not one of it is the thing that matters. And you know it isn't." She stepped closer. "I had a younger man, Caleb. Tom Avery sat in Hattie Pell's parlor 2 nights ago and offered me his good land and his sound house and his 40 years. And I said no. I said no before the boy ever took sick. You want to know why?" He didn't answer. He couldn't. "Because I stood in your yard for 8 weeks and I watched you," she said. "I watched you keep a chair ready for strangers. I watched you folded over 100 times. I fold an old woman's coins back into her hand. I watched you sit and listen to a passing stranger, like his troubles were the only thing in the world that night. I watched you tell me the worst about yourself in 4 honest lines, and let me decide when every other soul in my life decided for me. And last night I watched you haul cold water till your back gave out to save a boy that isn't even yours, and not once think to be thanked for it." Her eyes were wet now, and she let them be. "People look at you and they see your age. That's all they see, a number, gray hair, a man near done. I've never once seen your age, Caleb. From the first day on that porch I saw your heart. And your heart is the finest thing I've found in 30 years of looking." The gold light was full on her face. Somewhere the rooster crowed again, and a door opened back in the house, and the world was waking up around them. And Caleb Turner stood in the wet grass with all his careful walls falling down at once, soundless, the way a bank gives way in a flood. "To me," she said, low, "you're not too old. To me, you're perfect. You always have been. You're just the last one to know it." He'd carried something in his pocket for 3 weeks. He'd bought it the day after the church social, gone alone to the bank in town that did a little business in such things, and bought a plain gold band, a size he'd guessed at, and he'd carried it every day since and never once let himself believe he'd give it. His hand went to his pocket now, without his deciding it. His fingers closed on it. "I bought this a while back," he said. His voice came out wrecked. "Couldn't make myself believe I had the right to it. Figured I'd give it to you the day I worked up the nerve. And then I figured that day wasn't ever coming." He held it out in his rough palm, the little band catching the morning. "I'm an old fool, Amelia. Burl told me so, and Tom Avery sent word to tell me so. And I expect they're both right. I don't have 40 years to give you. I might not have 10. His hand shook and he let it. But every one I've got, every single one, I'd rather spend it with you than live to 100 without you. If you'll still have a stubborn old man who near threw away the best thing ever walked up his lane. Amelia took the ring out of his palm. She looked at it, and she looked at him, and she put it on her own finger because she wasn't going to wait on him to find the nerve. "I'll have you," she said. "I'd have had you in July if you'd had the sense to ask." And he reached for her then, finally after 11 years and 8 weeks and 1 long night. And she met him halfway, the way she'd been meeting him halfway all along while he kept stepping back. And he held her in the wet gold grass of the Hadley yard, with the whole waking world to see it. And, for the first time in longer than he could count, did not care one bit who was watching. "Come home," he said into her hair. "House is too quiet. There's a chair on the porch, wants sitting in." "There's 2 chairs," she said. "There's 2 chairs," he agreed. They married on the porch 3 weeks later. Reverend Cobb come out from town. Burl Tate standing up beside Caleb the way he had 40 years before. Della Hadley cried. The boy Samuel, pink and well again, carried the ring on a saddle pillow and dropped it once in the grass, and everybody laughed. Hattie Pell came too. She brought a pie, an apple pie still warm from her oven, and she set it on the rail without much to say. And at the end of the day she took Amelia's hand in both of hers. She took Amelia's hand in both of hers, and held it a moment and said only, "I was wrong about a great many things." And that was as near to grace as a proud woman gets. And Amelia took it kindly. Now the evenings come down soft over the oak woods. The leaves have gone to copper and gold and let down a little more sky each day. And the crickets sing in the long grass, and the lamp glows yellow in the cabin window. There are 2 rocking chairs on the porch. There are 2 tin cups on the rail. The finished quilt lies over both their knees against the cool of the dark. Ruth's stitches and Amelia's grown into one cloth you cannot read the seam of. Caleb sets out the cups of an evening and does not freeze anymore at the second one. "Reckon I'm not too old after all," he said, the first night they sat out together as man and wife. Amelia leaned her head against his shoulder and watched the fireflies come up out of the grass. "Never were," she said.